This video will look at the ethical concerns in research out of Chapter 6 or Chapter 11 out of our textbook. And ethics is concerned with what is right or wrong, bad or good, fair or unfair. And these are sort of the definitions that are described at the beginning of Chapter 6. And it is interested in character as well as conduct. It addresses matters of public policy, so that's what we'll talk about now, as well as more personal matters. So what has driven ethical issues in research are some previous examples of unethical behavior. Nazi experiments in World War II that led to the Nuremberg Code, and also here in the United States, Tuskegee syphilis study that had been ongoing for like 40 years. So these couple studies helped drive some guidelines for ethical issues in research. The Nuremberg Code was the first set of guidelines for research in 1947. Helsinki Declaration earlier in 1964 and more recently in 2013, an updated version, described and mandated the ethical standards for medical research. And the Belmont Report, which was a function of the Tuskegee Syphilis Institute study, described fundamental document that led to the current federal regulations in the United States. And this is called the Common Rule. The Common Rule are federal rules that govern research involving human participants in the United States. So a lot of the research in kinesiology involves human participants, and we doing research on human participants will follow this common rule. And part of that common rule, or what came out of that, were also institutional review boards. So any research done on human participants, that research needs to be submitted to an institutional review board that will oversee that research and approve then that research. So the basic principles of this Belmont report in 1979. And so I would recommend that you remember these basic principles. One is respect for persons. And this means that individuals have self-determination. So their participation in research is voluntary. So voluntary consent is essential. And the next basic principle is beneficence. And this obligates the researcher where there's the maximum potential benefit, so and minimize possible harm. And then also justice requires the benefits and burdens of the research to be fairly distributed with all participants. So here are three basic principles of the Belmont Report. And these were a result of, or this Belmont Report was a result of the Tuskegee syphilis study that was ongoing for 40 years. It was finally ended in 1972 or 1974. And it involved African Americans in Tuskegee, Alabama, that had syphilis, and blood samples were taken from these individuals. But these individuals were not given penicillin to try to, or to stop this. And there's some YouTube videos that describe this Tuskegee syphilis study. And so part of that Belmont report was an informed consent. So this is arguably the most important ethical standard, and it refers to telling the research participants about all the aspects of the research that might influence their decision to participate. So there are four important elements. the subjects or the volunteers need to be fully aware of what the research is and the purpose of the research. And the participants understand that consent is voluntary and that actually the participants can choose not to participate. So if they start the study, they can actually choose to withdraw from the study. And the person has legal capacity to give a consent. So the volunteers understand the nature and purpose of the research and that it was written and described to them in simple instructions so they understand what's going on. And that the responsibility for obtaining consent rests with the researcher. So 4 important elements of informed consent. And also there's part of this of protecting certain volunteers that may be considered vulnerable. So children, handicapped individuals, cardiac rehab patients, for example, pregnant women, prisoners. So particular precautions must be taken to protect the welfare of subjects that might be considered especially vulnerable or at risk. So if research was submitted to IRB, it would go through additional process or even follow the guidelines for these vulnerable subjects. And the research also must be, or the results of the research must be kept private. So this refers to the capacity of individuals to control the individual controls when and under what conditions others have access to their behaviors, beliefs, values. And confidentiality is treating subject information or responses in a manner so that it is not linked to any specific individual. So even though you may volunteer for a study, or if you have subjects volunteer for a study, they are not recognized by the name, for example. They're recognized by maybe a subject number. And this is normally addressed through that informed consent. And again, part of the Belmont report was the development of institutional review boards. And these institutional review boards are a federal mandate to make sure that we are in compliance. If you're doing research, you're in compliance. And the IRBs have authority to approve, require modifications, or disapprove of research. An IRB approval are required before any aspect of the research involving human subjects may commence. And typically there are 3 levels of IRB review. There's exempt from review, there's expedited review, and there's full review. And this depends on the amount of risk. Typically in kinesiology research, maybe it's exempt from review or it's expedited review. A full review, maybe if we were taking blood samples, that would require a full review, and just because there may be more risk involved with that. So what are the criteria for IRB approval? While the risks to the subjects are minimized, the risks to the subjects are reasonable in relation to the benefits. So, if we did a VO2 max test in the laboratory, there would be some risk to that. But let's make sure those risks are minimal. And to the benefit, if we're trying to research the effects of training on VO2 max, that can be a benefit. The selection of subjects is equitable in relation to the purpose of the research and its setting. Informed consent is sought from each of the subjects or volunteers. The informed consent document has to be approved. Provisions for monitoring data collection are approved and ensure the safety and the confidentiality of the data. So typically those are on a the data is kept in a locked file cabinet if it's a hard copy, or on a computer that's password protected. And so once once IRB is approved and research is completed, the research is typically the results of that research is somehow disclosed. And you've been reading papers or presentation of the research. And so an ethical decision in research is that this research that is being presented is that it is accurate and it represents what the research completed. So not to disclose inaccurate or deceptive or fraudulent research results. And to undermine this is to do so undermines the very nature of the scientific process. And this is called scientific misconduct. And unfortunately, there's examples of this. So scientific misconduct, fabrication, falsification, plagiarism of their practices that seriously deviate from those that are commonly accepted within the scientific community for proposing or conducting or reporting research. And there's an example of misconduct in reporting the findings. So one is plagiarism. And students can have problems with that, of copying other people's work. Scientists can plagiarize other people's work as well. So it involves presenting ideas or works of others as your own without giving proper credit to the authors. And self-plagiarism is presenting of your own work more than once. So if you present your work in one paper or in one presentation, it is unethical, it is misconduct to then present it, that same work in another paper. And authorship, it needs to be limited to those individuals who made a significant contribution to the research project. So these are types of scientific misconduct in the reporting of the findings. And there are other ethical obligations in research. The researcher is responsible for their participants. The researcher is responsible for their own actions and for those of any research aides. The participants must provide informed consent, and the researcher protects the participants from the harm and danger, discomfort, and as we mentioned, they must maintain anonymity and confidentiality. And the participants, they should not be coerced. The researcher has responsibility during and after the investigation to safeguard that participant data. So again, it's locked up or it's on a protected computer. And the researcher must provide honest disclosure of the results, even if it's not what they would like to find. This video described research involving human subjects. And there is also research involving animal subjects, and animal research has been a long part of biomedical studies and kinesiology. And doing animal research also requires an approval process as well. There's little research, animal research actually, that's done here at SUNY Cortland, yet there is a process of approval for doing animal research. So this was a video out of Chapter 6, or in our new version of the textbook, Chapter 11, that discussed the ethical concerns in research.